The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the state of Homeland Security Information Sharing, to review the progress of the federal government's information sharing efforts, and to explore the relationship between the Information Sharing Program Manager and the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Intelligence Officer. We will hear from two panels today. Our first witness will be Mr. John Russack, Information Sharing Program Manager in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Our second panel witnesses will be the Honorable Lee Hamilton, Vice Chairman of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project, and Mr. William Crowell from the Markle Foundation's Task Force on National Security in the Information Age. And I thank them all for being here today. Prior to being named Information Sharing Program Manager, our first witness, John Russack, was previously the Energy Department's Intelligence Director and served as Deputy Chief of External Operations and Cover Division for Counterintelligence. He was the Deputy Assistant Director of the Central Intelligence for Collection, was the Military Deputy Director of the DCI's Nonproliferation Center, and was Deputy to the Associate Director of Central Intelligence for Military Support. In other words, he's a seasoned intelligence professional who brings years of experience to the job. Preventing future terrorist attacks must be the primary goal of our Homeland Security efforts, and the ability to share relevant terrorist-related information is key to prevention. The Information Sharing Program Manager is the designated individual responsible for information sharing across the federal government and was given government-wide authority to ensure that all government agencies at the federal, state, local, tribal levels, as well as the private sector, share information about terrorists and terrorism. The program manager, in consultation with the Information Sharing Council, is responsible for developing, monitoring, and managing the information sharing environment, or ISE, which will provide the means for sharing terrorism information among all appropriate federal, state, local, and tribal entities, as well as the private sector. Establishing an information sharing environment is a difficult and complex undertaking and will require a concerted effort at all levels of government. We look forward to hearing your views on the current status of your efforts and your thoughts about the road ahead. I'm especially interested in how your relationship with the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Intelligence Officer is progressing, and whether or not you feel that you have the resources that you need and the authority that you need to get the job done. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member, the gentlelady of California, Ms. Lofgren, for any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll put my full statement into the record. But I do want to celebrate the fact that we are having this hearing. Probably, as I think about it, we should have had this hearing maybe before the last hearing we had, since we need to understand the ISE, which is central to any effective government-wide information sharing effort. As the Markle Foundation has noted, the ISE should not be limited to promoting communications between the various agencies that comprise the intelligence community. If we have all the shared intelligence in the world, if we don't get it out to the state, local, and tribal law enforcements, we're not going to achieve our goal. And I am pleased that I believe that Mr. Russack certainly understands that, and it's our job here to try and assist him in getting that accomplished. I would note that we are way behind in what we need to do. I'm very concerned that Mr. Russack's office is not yet properly funded or properly staffed. I think if we're going to ask him to lead the tough job that we've given to him, that we need to make sure he has the budgetary and support to accomplish the task. I also want to note that 4 years after 9/11 and more than a year after the issuance of the 9/11 Commission report, we're aware that federal departments and agencies are still using arguments based on interpretation of their authority prior to the Intelligence Reform Act to protect their turf. We need to work with our administrative leadership to correct this situation. I think this hearing is a part of that effort, but certainly not all that will be asked of us. And I yield back and will submit the rest of my statement for the record.
I thank the ranking member for her statement. I state for the record that all members of the subcommittee or members of the committee who attend can insert opening statements for the record. I now would like to welcome Mr. Russack to the subcommittee to remind him that his entire statement will be introduced into the record and that if he is able to limit his oral testimony to around 5 minutes, that will leave an opportunity for questions. Mr. Russack, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. It's a pleasure to be here. I would first of all like to state that I agree with everything the Chairman and the ranking minority member have said about the importance of information sharing to national security. I'd also like to say that I care. When I was asked if I would consider doing this job, I said yes, and the reason I said yes is because I believe that information sharing in our nation, and again, I emphasize the fact that this is a national issue. It's not a federal issue. It's not a state and local issue. It's everybody's issue. Information sharing in our nation is seminally the most important thing we can do to ensure our national security. And what I intend to do is execute the tasks that the Congress has laid out for me in the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. We have already turned in a deliverable that was due to the Congress on the 15th of June. In that, I talked about the impediments to information sharing, and I would like to point out at the onset that technology is not an impediment. Oftentimes, people tend to talk about information sharing in terms of technology or chief information officers, and many would draw the conclusion that these are technological issues. Not that there aren't technological issues, because there are, but technology is an enabler. It is not an impediment. Most of the time, there are technical solutions to solve many problems once we have identified problems in policy, law, culture, and the business model. And once we define the business rules, technologically, we can build a system that will, in fact, enable us to share information. So I care deeply about this issue. The intention of myself and my staff is to, in fact, make the existing information sharing environment better. Depending upon where you sit or where you stand and what you do, the scorecard for today's information sharing system would be, if we took a positive side, flawed, doesn't work perfectly, and if we took the negative side, some would argue that it doesn't work at all. I think post 9/11, across the federal government, we in fact are sharing information. It is not a perfect sharing. We need to do much better. We need to make sharing much more robust. I think we need to redefine the business rules. I think an awful lot of the problems have to do with roles, missions, responsibilities, and authorities and terrorism. If I look at the state, local, tribal, and private sector, I think that is where we really need to do a much better job. And when I talk to people at the state, local, tribal, and private sector, people representing those sectors, most of them are unhappy with the quality of information sharing. And I think if we're going to protect America, We need to do better at the federal level, and clearly we must do a whole lot better when we deal with state, local, tribal, and the private sector. Protection of sources and methods is an issue. However, clearly we can share information in a better way, in a much more effective way, and we can add context and perspective to the information we give to state, local, tribal, and the private sector. We also need to do business specifically for state, local, tribal, and the private sector, and across our nation, we need to do more business at the unclassified level. Today, in the 21st century, there are many, many sources of information beyond intelligence. Most large companies and businesses that I know of have their own intelligence organizations. Where do they get their information? Open source. There's an awful lot of information that's out there at the open source level. If we take that information and combine the information derived from national technical means, the classified stuff, we ought to be able to do a good job, a great job, a much more adequate job of protecting America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russack, for your testimony. I would like to make note of your preliminary report on the creation of the information sharing environment. This was your first deliverable, I believe. And you list several issues in here. One is the issue of current authorities and policies governing rules and responsibilities are in some cases ambiguous and conflicting, but the second one intrigues me the most. Organizations do not fully trust one another when sharing information. You've served in the intelligence community. You've been part of what I call the secrecy system. I spent 10 years in the CIA and over 30 years in military intelligence. The idea of intelligence information sharing was culturally anathema. You might share information with your colleagues, you might run information up and down your stovepipe, but you certainly were very reluctant to share it across the community for several reasons. One, your source might be jeopardized. Two, somebody else might take some credit for what you were doing. And so there's an issue of trust. There's an issue of whether or not a series of little intelligence bureaucracies can see clearly the national security advantages to sharing with others in a real-time and virtual environment. And this cultural change is very, very difficult to accomplish. How can you as a single individual somehow persuade this large collection of entities who up until recent years have pretty much operated on their own and without sharing? How can you break through this traditional culture and establish as a priority and a need and as a goal for everybody that we need to share this information?
Mr. Chairman, let me say first of all that you said me as a single individual. Clearly, me as a single individual, I'm not going to be able to affect the cultural change you described by myself. So I'm going to need the help of the President, the Congress, the executive branch, the entire legislative branch, and the heads of the various departments, agencies in our federal government. And let me take that even into a larger group. You know, all of us that comprise our nation need to demand that people share. We need to incentivize sharing. We need to reward sharing as opposed to reward protecting. It's obviously going to be iterative. We're not going to make fundamental changes in bureaucracy and culture overnight. We have to inculcate this, I think, in our training programs across the federal government and the nation. And I think only then will we be able to overcome concerns about trust. I would also say that leaks do not help. I mean, oftentimes, or many times, the federal government does share information. And there have been several instances of sharing and requesting that that information be kept confidential or be kept at a sensitive level, and we find that information above the fold or below the fold on the front page of newspapers and transmitted, broadcast across our country, both by satellite dishes and the broadcast media. So trust, I think, is key. I think you pointed that out very, very accurately. Culture has an awful lot to do with this, but we have to train people when we share information that is in fact sensitive to keep it sensitive. And clearly, we have not done an adequate job in that area.
I thank you for that answer. I've got the yellow light. Maybe we'll get to a second round. The chairman recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you. Mr. Russack, I appreciate your reaching out to the committee and your spirit of cooperation with us. I see us as your allies in your mission. And pursuant to that, I'm going to ask you a question I hope that you're able to answer, which is about the budget that you're working with. We are asking you to implement the information sharing environment, and I want to know the budget that you're working with, from where it's sourced, and what are your needs going to be on an ongoing basis?
The budget I am working with, let me go back to fiscal year 2005, and in fact, let me go back to December of 2004 when the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act was signed. That bill says that $20 million is authorized over the next 2 years to implement the information sharing environment, or words to that effect. In 2005, I actually received $9.6 million was appropriated for me to start standing up the office and to get going. In 2006, I do not have a budget line item. So I want to make sure I explain this correctly. I work for the President through the Director of National Intelligence. The Director of National Intelligence is working on a budget for me. I do not have a budget line item anywhere in an appropriations bill. Before I came to this committee, I actually did my homework today before I came to this hearing and said, I know that I don't officially have any money. Obviously, I now have a staff. It's not as large as it is going to be. It's going to be a very small staff once it is stood up. But I need, to answer your question, I think, based on what I intend to do, about $30 million a year. And to answer your question about the budget right now in fiscal year 2006, the answer is I am working with the Director of National Intelligence and his staff to actually come up internal to his budget with a line item. And again, I'm looking for about $30 million to do my job. I think I'm going to need $30 million a year to do my job as a minimum. Will I get that much money? I truly don't know. I have a feeling I'm going to get at least $20 million to do my job. I don't know what the exact number will be, but between the appropriation and some reprogramming done within the DNI's authority to do reprogramming, and in fact, if we add on supplementals, I will be shooting to get $30 million. I'd like to have a line item that had the $30 million figure in it.
Well, I'll just say that if you could actually accomplish the information sharing environment mission, that would be well worth the investment. It seems to me the country would be considerably safer. I'll just ask you one quick question before I'm out of time. Bill Dawson, the Deputy Intelligence Community Chief Information Officer, was quoted at an information sharing symposium last summer, not this summer, but the summer before this, that the DCI had established a mandatory right to release policy, and that there was going to be an enforcement mechanism that program funding would be taken away from those who didn't comply. Are you or the DNI proposing a right to release policy that will be applicable to the entire intelligence community, and will you have that kind of enforcement that was discussed last year?
Let me first of all address the right to release policy. There is already in effect a right to release policy. I think DSKID 8/1, and a DSKID is a DCI directive. Those in fact have been renamed something else now that we have a DNI. I do not know what the new name is.
Neither do I, so that's...
But that directive that Bill Dawson talked about last year does in fact talk about right for release, and it does mandate that people producing intelligence right to release. So that policy is in effect, and I think people are writing for release. But I think one of the things that we need to do within the intelligence community is remind people, educate people. Their customers are in fact not just in the intelligence community. The customer base for intelligence includes people in the state, local, tribal, and the private sectors, and many of those people don't have security clearances. So, as I said in my opening statement, we need to do more business at the unclassified level. We need to do a better job with tear lines. Tear lines we issue at the unclassified level do need to contain context and perspective. They need to contain enough information for people to make decisions, to take action, and to base action on to protect our country. Your question regarding, are we in fact enforcing that or penalizing in some way people who don't write for release? I'd like to take that as a question for the record, and I'll get back to you.
All right. That's fair enough. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Russack, good afternoon. As you know, the President recently signed an executive order creating the Information Security Council. It appears that there are no representatives of any state or local governments on this council. Doesn't this effectively freeze out states from having any say in what they need from DHS from an intelligence standpoint? And how can the council effectively serve the needs of first responders and local homeland security authorities when the states and local authorities are not even invited to participate? And you've acknowledged that we're not doing as good a job between federal down to state and local officials, so I'd like you to answer those questions.
Sir, the Information Sharing Council was established about 2 weeks ago, and I'm sure that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
I chair the Information Sharing Council. And I can assure you that we will include, there's nothing in that executive order that precludes the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, from reaching out and including state, local, tribal, and the private sector in that council. It is my intention to do exactly that. I mean, I agree with the thrust of your question. We cannot create an information sharing environment without taking into account the needs of state, local, tribal, and private sector people. And my intention is, as the Information Sharing Council, by the way, the first meeting will be a week from this coming Friday, and we will, based on what the discussion items and the issues we're attacking and teeing up for resolution are, reach out and have representatives from state, local, tribal, and the private sector help us frame those issues for resolution and help us frame options to solve problems.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear you said that. I know it wasn't in the executive order, but I'm glad to hear that you're going to include them. But you also acknowledged during your opening comments that many state and local authorities have complained about intelligence or information sharing. I've heard that quite loudly from some of my folks in my home state. And the complaint I often hear is that the products that are disseminated by DHS are either irrelevant or untimely or both. What suggestions do you have to make DHS better able to suit the needs of these local authorities? Because as you know, they're the ones who are going to be tasked with responding to assessments that DHS is supposed to be providing.
Let me say, first of all, that my deputy, I'm going to have two deputies. One of my deputies is here today, Sue Reingold, the lady on my far right. Sue Reingold is from the Department of Homeland Security. She will be a detailee to the program manager's staff. Sue comes from the state and local government portion of the Department of Homeland Security. Sue is going to help me in our task of providing state, local, tribal, and the private sector with the information we need. DHS recently selected Charlie Allen, to be the Assistant Secretary for Information Analysis. I was Charlie's deputy for 2.5 years of my life. He trained me to some degree. I hope I, trained him to some degree also. But I can assure you that the relationship between my office and the Department of Homeland Security, and we can't leave out the Department of Justice when we talk about, or the FBI, when we talk about state, local, tribal, and the private sector. We're going to be a team, and we are in fact going to do a better job. I think all the people who head those agencies, and I mentioned Charlie Allen, I can assure you that he and I had lunch a week ago, and we talked about ways in which we would in fact positively affect the way we share information with the customers you describe, and we're going to do it, sir.
Well, I'm glad to hear you mention Charlie Allen. That was one of my questions, so I'm glad to see that that's moving forward well. But finally, I just want to suggest one thing. When you do sit down with state and locals, I have some people I think who could give you some guidance as to what types of assistance that you can provide to them, how you can be more helpful to them. And I have some very good contacts. I represent a large state, Pennsylvania, and I think it would be useful to talk to those people about how you go about what you're doing here.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to discussing this at greater length with you and getting those names, and I look forward to meeting with those people and finding out what their needs are and working as a team to solving them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes the distinguished lady from New York who has been a great leader in Homeland Security, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for calling this hearing because it is so important. And as my colleagues have mentioned several times, I hear about this all the time. And we do hear that it's getting better, but it's just not good enough. So I thank you very much for your testimony. As you said, it's clear that long-held attitudes and procedures pose a great challenge, which is probably the understated statement, the most understated statement we've made today. And I agree wholeheartedly with the recommendation of the 9/11 Commission with respect to providing incentives for information sharing between government agencies and state and local authorities. It seems to me it's simply not enough to say we support or encourage information sharing. This is tough. It's hard to do. Every department has its own procedures in place, and they don't want to share. It seems, based upon all the information we've received, there needs to be a comprehensive system of carrots and sticks to ensure that it happens. Now, according to testimony that we'll hear later on in this hearing, The former 9/11 commissioners have indicated that there has been minimal progress toward implementation of this recommendation. So if you could follow up your previous comments and describe your progress toward instituting concrete incentives to encourage information sharing, I'd be most appreciative. I guess what most of us are pretty concerned about is 9/11 is in the past. We've been hearing about information sharing a long time. We've been hearing about the barriers between various officials that don't want to share information. What are you really doing about it? And could you describe the progress towards that end?
Certainly. Let me first of all say that when you ask about concrete incentives, I'm going to walk backwards a little bit and say that.
I'd rather say you were appointed by the president. He says do it, and that should be enough for any member of the administration. Just do it. But since that doesn't seem to happen, that's why I'm talking about concrete incentives.
Mr. Dent mentioned a moment ago the Information Sharing Council. I think the establishment of this council goes a long way to actually helping us, we the nation, achieve concrete examples of what we're going to do to solve the information sharing problem. Most of the problems, as I stated before, are not technical problems. They're roles, missions, responsibilities, authorities problems, policies that we need to change or modify to enable information sharing. In June, when I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, I had myself and one other person on my staff. Right now I have a dozen, and we should be up to about 25 by the end of this month. The Information Sharing Council did not exist until a week ago. That is up. The first meeting will be a week from Friday. I can't really talk in real terms, concrete terms, about what my staff has done beyond a few things. The staff has stood up. The Information Sharing Council, required by laws, stood up. We are, in fact, working pilots. I'm working 2 pilot programs right now. I'd like to be working 10 or a dozen. I have a pilot program with the FBI field office in New York City on information sharing. We are taking intelligence community information via the National Counterterrorism Center and getting sensitive but unclassified information to FBI special agents in the field. That is proving to be very, very useful and very, very valuable to them. I have a plan to export that not only to the FBI field office in New York City, but also to the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. I'd like to also get New York City Police involved in this pilot program, as well as the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Police involved in that program. That's one example of a pilot program, something tangible that we're doing. When you do a pilot like that, first of all, it's very cheap, relatively speaking. It does cost money. That's one of the things I would like to put more money into and expand that to some major cities across the country and major police departments. But when you do a pilot like that, immediately or very quickly after you establish the pilot, you actually are seeing information being shared at a much better level, a much higher level. We're sharing information with them. We're sharing pictures on handheld devices in the field that aids in identification of individuals coming into our country. Another pilot that we're working is with the Department of Energy and the DOE National Laboratories. It is a pilot that's focused on nuclear terrorism. It is focused on security of fissile material, and it's focused on getting the advantage of the DOE National Laboratories over many people is they have probably the national treasure trove in nuclear expertise. They're the people that build the U.S. government's weapons. They maintain the nuclear stockpile. So what we're doing is leveraging the DOE national laboratories and providing them information sharing, information access, providing them with more information with which to help us assess the terrorist threat and to do validation of reporting, and in fact to try and get them to help targeting of collection. So that's two concrete examples of just pilots. And what I would like to do is run 10 or 12 pilots by the end. I can't say the end of the year, we're getting there pretty quickly, but over the next 360 days, if I come back and talk to you a year from now, I would like to tell you about 10 information sharing pilots that we're working, that in fact are providing better information, better quality information to first responders, to state, local, tribal, and the private sector. And at the same time we're giving them information, we're fleshing out policy issues. For example, in the New York City pilot with the FBI, we're actually seeing directives and policy issues that need to be changed to enable a better flow of information.
Well, the red light is blinking away. Let me thank you, and I look forward to hearing progress, especially with the New York City pilot, because as you probably know, after 9/11, the New York City Police Department ended up developing its own counterintelligence unit. They have people all over the world because of the lack of appropriate information sharing and accurate information sharing. So if there is progress, I am really pleased, and I look forward, Mr. Chairman, in getting continuing updates. Thank you very much.
And just for the information of the subcommittee, we have done a classified briefing on the New York Transit issue, and the Chief Information Officer of the Department of Homeland Security attended that, as did other officials. And so we have been doing quite a bit of work in focusing on information sharing relative to that incident. And I believe there will be additional visits to New York City in the future to work that dimension of the problem.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just thank you, because I attended one of the meetings, and because of a conflict, I couldn't attend the second one. But I thought the Department of Homeland Security's response was totally inappropriate and out of order, and I do believe that was the view of almost every member of this committee who attended that meeting. If they had a beef with New York City, and I'll tell you, if I had to depend on, I won't contrast it. Let me just say I have tremendous confidence in Commissioner Ray Kelly. And I think if the Department of Homeland Security thinks they know more and knows different, it shouldn't have been aired on the front pages of the paper. But we'll leave it at that, and thank you for following up.
Absolutely. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Russack, I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate your testimony. I have a couple of questions, follow on to a question Mr. Dent had first raised in relation to this anyway. It's my understanding that the President has assigned you the responsibility for completing guidelines prescribing how the intelligence community should convert classified intelligence information to a shareable format for use by state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers, an obligation imposed in the Intelligence Reform Act. Those deadlines were due on September 13th, 2005, but apparently were delayed because of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So my question is, have the guidelines been completed, and if not, why not, and when can we expect them? And if you'd like to comment further, to what extent you did, I guess, answer the question of to what extent the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Intelligence Officer, Charlie Allen, has been involved in this process. You could expand upon that if you would, and again, particularly his role in the development of those guidelines.
Let me first of all address the second part, Charlie Allen's involvement in the guidelines. Charlie hasn't been at the Department of Homeland Security, as you know, sir, very long, I think probably about 3 or 4 weeks at this point in time. The Department of Homeland Security the process for establishing the guidelines, writing the guidelines, was that there is an information sharing PCC. PCC is a policy coordinating committee. It is chaired by a representative, a senior director from the Homeland Security Council, as well as by a senior director from the National Security Council. The information sharing PCC, along with the members of the PCC, I am a member of the PCC, the DNI's CIO, Chief Information Officer, is a member. Most of the federal departments and agencies are members of that PCC. We as a group drafted guidelines, and we drafted guidelines for White House staffing. The Department of Homeland Security was very much involved in the drafting of those guidelines, as were all departments and agencies. To answer your question on basically where are they, the guidelines were drafted, and I think, again, I'm not an expert on where they stand at the present time, but I know the guidelines, we asked for an extension. We, the federal government, I'm speaking with a big we here, the administration asked for an extension and actually talked to various committees on the Hill because of the hurricanes that you mentioned. And the guidelines are in final staffing. Yeah, and
when can the committee expect them? We will be able to.
Can I take that for the record, sir? Because I'm not sure I'm in a position to really answer that. I'll have to get back to the people who are actually staffing those and get you an answer.
That would be fine. We would, the committee I know would appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from you on that.
Yes, sir.
Well, the other question I have is, could you describe basically your key successes thus far in helping to implement the information sharing environment, and to what extent those successes depend on cooperation from various agencies that comprise the intelligence community? And in fact, even further, are there any members of the intelligence community that are not effectively cooperating with you?
Let me go in reverse again, if I can. I think all members of the intelligence community are, in fact, cooperating. And I can assure you that the Director of National Intelligence is insisting that they cooperate. And when people don't cooperate with me, I tell my boss, my immediate boss, the DNI, and he is more than happy to pick up the phone or to talk to someone about any lack of coordination. So there is cooperation. And I can assure you that the DNI wants to share. And I can assure you, as I said earlier today, that we can and will protect sensitive sources and methods, and we will share the information people need to base decisions on to protect America. So there is a desire to share. There is, in fact, the leadership mandating sharing. Key successes, I think the two pilots I mentioned to the General Congresswoman from New York are pilots that are going, and they will be, I think, very successful. I would like to have, as I said earlier, about 10 or 12 of these pilots operating over the next year. The fact that we have an information sharing council that, as Congressman Dent, mentioned, and asked good questions about how we were, in fact, going to take into account the needs of state, local, tribal, and the private sector. The fact that this council, we have the names of the representatives across our federal government. We're going to reach out through Global Justice, through the National Association of Governors, and through other mechanisms. We're going to reach out to people in the state, local, and the private sector. We are going to, in fact, find out what is not working the way it should work, what information is not being shared, what information do they need, what are their requirements, and we're going to, in fact, develop options that will allow information to be shared, allow people to have access to information that they need. So my staff and my achievements thus far, I mean, I would like to be further ahead of where I am at the present time. As I said earlier, back in June I had a staff of 2. Now I have a dozen. I have a dozen really good people. I've been offered as many as 50 or 100 people. I've talked to a lot of people. I have not taken anyone on my staff that I have not personally hand-selected with the skill sets, the passion, the motivation to get the job done. So, concrete examples of where I am: we have an information sharing council. First meeting will be a week from Friday. We have some pilots in operation. I am working hard on the deliverables I owe to the Congress. The President and I, in conjunction with this information sharing council, are to make a report to you, members of Congress, by the 17th of June on more specificity on what this new information sharing environment is going to be. How will it work? That is what we're working on. And right now, we have 3 working groups, actually steering groups in place. Those steering groups are actually getting their arms wrapped around existing federal, state, local, tribal, private sector programs that exist, that mandate and foster information sharing. The steering groups are, in fact, trying to get their arms around all the working groups that various departments have that are ongoing. For example, inside the DNI's world, there is an entity called the Information Sharing Working Group. And then there's the Information Sharing Working Group -L, which deals with foreign liaison. We're taking into account all the things that are going on and getting our arms wrapped around that. I have a contract with an FFRDC to help me baseline the existing information sharing environment. And one exists now, as I said earlier. It's flawed.
For the record, FFRDC, for the
federally funded research and development activity. Those are think tanks that are not for profit, sir. I took data that was given to me by the Office of Management and Budget and turned that over to this FFRDC, and I said, help me baseline the existing environment. Help me get my arms wrapped around what existing federal programs various departments have. So what they have done is they've come back to me with a preliminary report. I got it last week, and the 4 major federal agencies that play in information sharing. The first one being the entire intelligence community. They've given me a preliminary report on what the IC is doing in information sharing, what systems are being used. The next one is the Department of Homeland Security, what they're doing in information, what systems are being used. The Department of Defense, same for them, and also Justice, Department of Justice, and the FBI. So that's probably all I can really say in response to your question on something concrete that we have done thus far.
Well, I see my time has expired, but you've painted obviously a picture of a very aggressive and comprehensive agenda, perhaps a bit rosy picture you've presented, but I certainly wish you well, and the committee will be looking forward, I'm sure, to hearing more from you on the progress that you're making. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman. I see that our second panel has arrived, but before I introduce them, I would like to make one comment. You mentioned open sources of intelligence as an important adjunct to the classified side. And clearly, open sources of intelligence obviate the problems of information sharing. And I think that that is an important capability that we need to think about in the future. I also note that issue 1 in your report regarding current authorities concludes that it's not clear at this point whether statutory changes will be required to clarify these governance issues. I would urge you and your staff to notify us if statutory changes are necessary, and this subcommittee would be more than happy to consider those and move those forward on an urgent basis, because we feel that information sharing is critically important to our national security. I also note that there are several major reports and guidelines that are coming due in the coming months, and we encourage you to work hard to meet those deadlines, again, because of the importance of these issues. On the issue of money, 20 million or 30 million, the ranking member and I will take that issue under advisement, and we will do our best effort here to address that issue in the coming weeks and months in a bipartisan fashion. That being said, on behalf of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for your testimony, but more important, I want to thank you for taking on a job that is not easy, that involves breaking a little glass, that involves moving our intelligence capabilities in a direction that previously was very difficult to move, and we hope that you will consider this subcommittee to be a co-partner in the enterprise.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair now calls the second panel to the table, the Honorable Lee Hamilton, Vice Chairman of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project, and Mr. William Crowell from the Markle Foundation's Task Force on National Security in the Information Age. The Honorable Lee Hamilton is the Director of the Center on Congress at Indiana University and also serves as President and Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington, D.C. He served from 1965 to 1999 as a U.S. Representative from Indiana. During his tenure, he served as Chairman and Ranking Member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and was also Chairman of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He served as Vice Chairman of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, or the 9/11 Commission, and is now Vice Chairman of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project. Welcome, Mr. Hamilton, and now I'd like to yield to the ranking member for the introduction of Mr. Crowell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's nice to split up the introductions. Bill Crowell, until recently a constituent of mine, is an independent consultant now, also Director and Chairman of the Board of Broadware Technologies, Director of ArcSight, and Director of NARIS. He was appointed in 2003 to the Unisys Corporate Security Advisory Board to address emerging security issues and best practices, and in September 2003 he joined the advisory board at ChoicePoint, a data aggregation company. Bill Crowell served as President and Chief Executive Officer of Cylink, a leading e-business security solution company, until it was acquired in February 2003 by SafeNet. Prior to all of this, and when I first met him, Mr. Crowell served for nearly 4 years as Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, where he had held a series of senior positions, including Deputy Director of Operations. He also, in 1999, was appointed to the President's Export Council and chaired the PEC Subcommittee on Encryption, where he did good work. And in March of 2001, the Secretary of Defense appointed him to the Federal Advisory Committee that conducted a comprehensive review of the U.S. Nuclear Command and Control System. As you've noted, Mr. Chairman, he served on the Markle Foundation Task Force since 9/11, and I would say really Bill in his entire professional career as well as a volunteer has spent his life trying to make sure our country was safe, for which we thank him and also welcome his testimony today.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Lee Hamilton. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Good to see you again. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Chairman Simmons and Ranking Member Lofgren and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. The first point I want to make simply is an expression of thanks to you for your efforts on oversight of the intelligence sharing, information sharing problem. I think it's enormously important that that be done and that you keep close track of it, and I'm pleased that you're doing that. And I think the view of all the commissioners, no single step is more important than information sharing in our efforts to strengthen the intelligence community and thereby ensure the safety and security of the American people. In our view, it was poor information sharing that was the single greatest failure of our government in the lead up to the 9/11 attacks. And it was a contributing factor to the government's missteps in understanding and responding to the threat of al-Qaeda. If you look at the missed opportunities, and we laid them out in our report, there are a good many of them, almost all of them involved in some way or the other the failure to share information. The second point I want to make is with regard to the 9/11 Commission recommendations. We really made two in this area. One is that information procedures have to provide incentives for sharing to restore a better balance between security and shared knowledge. That's not easy to do. We recognize that, but it's essential. And secondly, the second recommendation was that the President has to lead the government-wide effort to bring major national security institutions into the information revolution. He only is the person that can coordinate it and do it. You have now, of course, enacted into law the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, and I will give you a quick view of how we look at the progress under that act thus far. Despite the enactment of the statute, despite the creation of the Program Manager Office, it's our view that we've really made minimal progress toward establishing a seamless information sharing system. You can change the law, you can change the technology, you still have to change the culture. And you need to motivate institutions and individuals to share information. We commend Mr. Russack and his small team. We think they're demonstrating a very strong commitment to the whole concept of information sharing. Congress has authorized, but not yet, as I understand it, appropriated funding for the Program Manager's Office, and he and the information sharing program need a lot of support. It is our view that agencies still want to control the information they produce. They view it as their property, rather than the property of the entire government and the property of the American people. And for information sharing to work, of course, the right people have to get the right information at the right time. We're particularly concerned about the poor information sharing with state and local authorities. We're troubled by a number of stories. We've heard about that. I'll not go into that in detail unless you want to on the questions. Let me just conclude my remarks by saying that we think there are several important steps that need to be taken. One, to press the Congress to ensure that the program manager gets the funding and the resources and the personnel he needs to carry out his very important mission. If that is not done, you will not get good flow of information. Second, the program manager will need very strong support from the President and direct engagement of the senior leadership of the Homeland Security Council. Third, to press the executive branch to produce the information sharing reports that are already required by law. I was listening to the testimony a moment ago, and it's encouraging, but what struck me about it just the few minutes I was sitting here is that it's very future-oriented. The important thing is, what are the capabilities now? What can they do right now? The terrorists are not going to wait. We have to have these capabilities in place now. And when I hear this testimony, not just from the program manager but others, I just don't have a sense that they have a sense of urgency about this problem. It's a kind of a business-as-usual approach. So these reports are required by law. The September guidelines from the President to the executive agencies are late already. The December report is a crucial report, and I urge the committee, the subcommittee here, to make completion of the report and its implementation a very high priority. Fourth, I believe this committee should revisit the question as to whom the program manager reports to. He reports now to the DNI, but his responsibilities with regard to information sharing go inside the intelligence community, go beyond that, include information sharing for other federal agencies, for state and local tribal authorities and the private sector. And I think you ought to consider very carefully whether or not he would be more effective if he were placed in the executive office of the President with direct line authority from the President. So, to conclude, we need to change from a system in which the originating agency of classified information is the sole arbiter of which other agencies are allowed to see the information. That's the deeply rooted culture in the intelligence community. And that's far too restrictive for the kind of information flow you need in a good counterterrorism strategy. The right information must be made available instantly at all levels of government and to the private sector, and that requires a change in the culture. The actions of those who would do us harm are not under our control, but our system of information sharing is under our control. It demands urgent attention. We can fix it. There certainly will be no excuse if we fail to do it. Thank you very much for the attention you're paying to this critical problem. All of us on the Commission, former commissioners, are grateful to you, and we look forward to your continued oversight of this very important matter.
Thank you for that testimony, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Crowell.
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman Lofgren and distinguished members, thank you very much for allowing me to be here and testify before the subcommittee. I have had the privilege of being a member of the Markle Task Force on National Security in the Information Age since its inception in March of 2002, and it was created specifically to focus on how best to mobilize information and intelligence resources to improve security while still protecting privacy and civil liberties. The Markle Foundation has issued 2 reports. Both of those reports have stressed the importance of a decentralized network of information sharing and analysis that achieves security while at the same time protecting our civil liberties. And it has also stressed the need to have clear and understandable rules and business practices on collection and sharing of information that is permissible and that which is not permissible. And I will stress that point a couple of times in my opening remarks. On September 6th of this year, co-chairman Jim Barksdale and Zoe Baird sent a letter to the President on behalf of the task force on our thoughts on the progress of the information sharing environment. The letter is attached to my testimony along with the response from the White House. In addition, Zoe Baird testified to the House Intelligence Subcommittee on Oversight at an open hearing on October 19, 2005, and my remarks today largely parallel and mirror the letter and the subsequent testimony. I really recognize that John Russack has a very, very difficult job, but I'd like to try and outline 5 points that we in the Markle Foundation believe are important to getting on with the task. The first one is to reestablish a sense of urgency to share information. To the earlier point made, we have a lot of information today and we can share it today. We don't have to wait till tomorrow to begin doing that. So getting the information sharing business right will pay dividends not just for preventing terrorism attacks, but also for dealing with natural disasters as well. And so consistent and persistent leadership is needed in order to put all of the well-meaning people on the right path to getting this done. The second point is to empower the program manager with the resources and statute he needs to create the information sharing environment. John now has 12 people, according to his earlier testimony. He obviously needs many more than that. He needs a budget and a budget line item that he can depend on and be able to plan against. And I think, by the way, that giving him the position of chair of the Information Sharing Policy Coordinating Committee would go a long way toward increasing his stature in getting this job done. Third point is translate the law and executive orders into government-wide consistent guidelines. What we have today is an agency-by-agency interpretation of what they can and cannot do, and it varies widely, both in the areas of security and in the area of privacy, which is an impediment to getting on with this job. So new laws and executive orders have not yet been translated into new practices and guidelines, and it's business as usual. Nothing has really changed. So the ambiguities and the lines of responsibility are actually impeding people's agreement to move toward a vision of sharing information. So we need guidelines that will establish uniform rules and procedure for the security of information and for the protection of privacy and civil liberties. We need to update the U.S. person rule, which in many agencies restricts the flow of information when the information was lawfully collected in the first place, but restricts it for reasons that are not clear in terms of protecting personal privacy. We need to change the classification procedure. This is a crucial topic, as it's already been mentioned. Many agencies believe they own the information. They express that ownership in the form of originator-controlled information, and that should be used very judiciously. And the rules regarding classification should clearly distinguish between information that is actionable and the sources and methods from which that information came from. We should ensure policy compliance, oversight, and dispute resolution structures that keep the policies viable. I can't emphasize enough the need to have dispute resolution structures, because people are going to want to break crockery in getting actionable information to state, local, and tribal and private sectors. John's comment on technology was appropriate. It is not an impediment, it is a path and an enabler, but I would point out that the acquisition of new technology must be streamlined, and new legislation that has given agencies the flexibility they need to buy needed IT systems are not being used effectively by those agencies. Fourth point, we need to adopt a risk management approach to information sharing. We are not advocating that all information be shared with everyone. We suggest, though, that when information has real actionable value, the way should be found to share that information. And perfect information security in this trusted system is not going to be possible, and the cost of getting it might be too high. The current approach does not consider risk from failing to share, and I don't think you can connect dots that you can't get access to. Finally, the fifth item, we think we need to focus on establishing trusted information sharing relationships, particularly with the state, local, tribal organizations and private sector, rather than on continuous reorganizations of the manner in which we address this. Many state and local officials in the private sector feel disenfranchised, and the community of intelligence and law enforcement needs to treat them as partners. The final comment I would make has to do with responsibility and accountability. The law and executive order now gives responsibility for creating the ISA to the Director of National Intelligence. And this creates a particular problem for the program manager as he tries to reach out to the other components that are outside the DNI. He cannot really look to DNI resources for the law enforcement and for some of the other activities that he will be involved in, and that poses an interesting but certainly solvable problem. My conclusion is this is all about leadership. It's about a common vision of sharing information in order to protect the American public. It's about a common strategy, how to get there, and it's about accountability. And I would urge that this committee continue to review the progress. It's a very important area for the nation, And once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify.
I thank you both for your testimony. Normally, I would take my 5 minutes of questions at this point, but I see the distinguished Vice Chairman of the full committee has come in, and I suspect that it would be intelligent to extend to him the courtesy of taking my time because I know how busy it is. So the Chairman yields to the distinguished Vice Chairman, the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank my good friend and Chairman for yielding and for his leadership along with the distinguished ranking member. I thank our witnesses for coming in today and would like to say that this hearing is perhaps one of the most important subjects that we have to focus on relative to protecting the homeland from any emerging threats. And it's an issue that's not new to this Congress. It was this Congress that created the Gilmore Commission and the 4 reports of the Gilmore Commission, chaired by former Governor Jim Gilmore, that issued 3 reports before 9/11. And in each of those reports, you'll find references to this very issue. So the Congress was, in fact, on the lead in the need for information sharing when it comes to information sharing both vertically and horizontally, and the need to tear down the firewalls with the stovepipes of the 33 classified systems managed by 15 different agencies. In fact, it was the Congress that had language in 3 successive defense bills in 99, 2000, and 2001 that mandated, at least from DOD standpoint, where I sit as the Vice Chairman, that we push toward integration. Unfortunately, on November the 4th of 1999, in spite of John Hamre encouraging such an initiative to create a national collaborative environment, the CIA and the FBI, after attending a meeting with John Hamre in my office, said publicly, we don't need that capability. Well, we've now learned some other important information that troubles me, and that's why I'm here, Mr. Chairman, because we can't move forward unless we understand the lessons of the past. And I wish I didn't have to come to this hearing for this purpose, but I'm here for this purpose because I have not yet received any responses. Approximately June of this year, I learned the details of a top-secret military program called Able Danger. My first contact was to call the staff director of the 9/11 Discourse Project to ask if they had looked at Able Danger, because there was no mention of it at all, even a footnote, in the 9/11 Commission report. My chief of staff got the response the next day that, well, we looked at it, but we decided not to go down that route. And they were the terms that were used, not to go down that route. I then met with Tim Romer a week later, and I said to Tim, were you ever briefed on Able Danger? He said, no, Kurt, never heard of it, never briefed. I said, a top-secret program that was ordered by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the command of General Schoomaker at SOCOM, and you were never briefed, and it was specifically against al-Qaeda? He said, never. So I called John Lehman and had lunch with him. And John Lehman told me to lunch he had never been briefed either. And when I told him the details of Able Danger, he was livid. I said, what do I do, John? He said, you've got to pursue it. So I went to the floor of the House and did a 45-minute speech. Of course, nobody pays attention to 45-minute speeches. And during the month of July, I went to our committee chairs, Armed Services, Homeland Security, Intelligence, Oversight of Appropriations. And the New York Times picked the story up the first week of August with a front-page story above the fold on Tuesday. The response by the 9/11 Commission was that they denied there was ever a briefing on Able Danger. The New York Times ran a story the second day. And they said, well, there was a briefing, but there was never a mention of Mohammed Atta. And the New York Times ran the story a third day. The 9/11 Commission said, well, there was a briefing, yes, Mohammed Atta's name was mentioned, but it wasn't until July, 1 week before our report was done, and we determined it wasn't historically significant. In fact, they used the terms historically insignificant. Mr. Chairman, we've now determined, not through 9/11 Commission work, and I supported the 9/11 Commission with my vote and my voice, at least 5 professional employees of DOD have publicly stated that Mohammed Atta was identified before 9/11. And it wasn't just done by the Army's legal. We now know, thanks to no help of the 9/11 Commission, that there was a separate massive data mining effort that was conducted down in Garland, Texas, under the auspices of the Raytheon Corporation. And guess who, Mr. Chairman, the head of that was? 9/11 Commission doesn't have a clue because they never interviewed the guy. It was Sam Johnson's son, one of our most dedicated members. And Sam Johnson's son, Dr. Bob Johnson, is now ready to testify, along with the other military folks on the record, that he too identified Mohammed Atta before 9/11. Now we have 2 separate data mining operations that are ready to come public and testify they both identified Mohammed Atta by name and in one case by photo before 9/11. Now, this is not about a chart, as people have tried to say. In fact, we know there was 2.5 terabytes of data collected about al-Qaeda, specifically ordered by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, 2.5 terabytes of data is equal to 1/4 of all the printed material in the Library of Congress. That's historically insignificant, I might add. And now we also know on the record, and the Senate Judiciary Committee has taken these statements, and I've been there witnessing it, that there was an attempt made in September of 2000 to transfer information about the Brooklyn cell of al-Qaeda to the FBI 3 times. The FBI employee who set those meetings up will state that under oath, which he did to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We know that those meetings were canceled. Not one mention of this in the 9/11 Commission report. We now know that there was a 3-hour briefing provided for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in September of 01, or in January of 01. And now what do we see the response? We're here to talk about sharing information and public knowledge and accountability. We see this administration and the 9/11 Commission not willing to talk about it on the record. Now, that's outrageous, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not here to criticize just any Democrat. I'm here to criticize this administration, which I supported. They've gagged the witnesses that will come forward. Now, I sent a letter to the 9/11 Commission on August the 10th. I have yet to receive a response. This is November the 8th. I've yet to receive, and I got a letter congratulating me for my work on the frequency spectrum allocation issue, but not a response to my letter about what is, in fact, the most important information prior to 9/11 that Louis Freeh, Mr. Chairman, on national TV 2 weeks ago, when he was questioned by Tim Russack, said, and I was, quote, "That's the kind of tactical intelligence," meaning able danger, and he named able danger, "that would make a difference in stopping a hijacking." We're very interested in what the 9/11 Commission didn't do with respect to able danger. That's not Kurt Weldon, that's Louis Freeh, FBI director, when 9/11 occurred. Mr. Chairman, there's something wrong here. There is something wrong. When we're supposed to be getting the facts for the 3,000 families, and I was with the families up in Harvard University with my good friend Jane Harmon just a few weeks ago, and they pleaded with me to get the information. When we now know that there was information 2 days before the attack on the USS Cole that could have stopped the crew from the USS Cole from losing 17 of their sailors, and I had the captain of that ship in, Commander Kirk Lippold, 2 weeks ago, who said if I would have had the information that they had, I wouldn't have taken my ship into port. So I said, Mr. Chairman, what's going on here? We're talking about sharing information. Am I hearing it, that no one really wants to share information? We want to spin things? Let the truth come out. Right now, Defense Intelligence Agency is destroying the career of Lieutenant Colonel Scott Tony Schaefer. And I'm not going to allow that to happen. I haven't heard a peep out of the 9/11 Commission to ask for more information, not a response to my letter. Mr. Chairman, I'm a little bit upset because we don't know the information about what happened prior to 9/11. This is not about a chart of one person. It's about 2.5 terabytes of data collected by 2 separate data banks, neither of whom were talked to by the 9/11 Commission. It looks to me like a cover-up, Mr. Chairman. That's what it looks like. And so I have 2 questions. Mr. Hamilton, when can I expect a response to my letter of August the 10th, which was sent to you and Mr. Kane? And number 2, will you join in calling for a full and open hearing to allow all able danger people, and that's 6 individuals. There weren't 80 involved. There were 20 total. 6 are willing to come forward. Are you willing to call for a public hearing, allowing them all to testify, and also to have Dieter Snell testify under oath about his interview of Scott Philpott in July of 04? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weldon. First of all, with regard to the response, we're operating, as you may know, with a very skeleton staff. We no longer have the 80-some staff members that we had under the 9/11 Commission. We will respond to you, we should, and we'll try to get a response promptly to you. Secondly, we understand on the Commission that we were writing the first draft of history, if you would. We understand that information will be coming forth probably for the next century about what happened on 9/11. and we in the Commission must remain open to new information. Now, let me tell you why we did what we did. The Commission based its report first on facts that were obtained by, supported by documentary evidence, and secondly, by witnesses who had direct first-hand knowledge of documents they produced and the events they described. Those persons that now make the claim about Atta's name on the chart cannot produce the chart. They did not do the analysis, and they cannot reproduce the analysis. Many serious questions have to be addressed to these people. And I think, so far as I personally am concerned, Mr. Weldon, I can't speak for all commissioners. I'm perfectly willing to support hearings with regard to these witnesses, because I think there are serious questions that need to be addressed to them. We interviewed General Schumacher. He was the commander of the Special Operations Command at the time Able Danger was created. We interviewed General Hugh Shelton, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Scott Fry, General Gregory Newbold, all successive directors of operations for the Joint Staff. We interviewed Brian Sheridan, the Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, during the period that Able Danger was in existence. We also interviewed several other senior and mid-level managers of the Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict program. Despite direct questions for any information relevant to the 9/11 attacks, none of them mentioned such a chart. They mentioned nothing about identifying Muhammad Atta, even in response to questions about the Able Danger program. We interviewed Mr. Stephen Hadley for 3 hours. He responded to questions from the Joint Congressional Inquiry. He mentioned nothing about that chart, mentioned nothing about the name of Muhammad Atta being on the chart. We interviewed his boss at the time, Condoleezza Rice, for over 4 hours. She said nothing about a chart and mentioned nothing about the name of Muhammad Atta on the chart. We interviewed her boss, President Bush, for nearly 3 hours. Neither he nor the Vice President said anything about a chart or the name of Muhammad Atta on a chart. The White House has not confirmed the existence of the chart. There is, so far as I know, no evidence to document that such a chart ever existed. Now, one other point I'd make here, that even if everything that you say is correct about Muhammad Atta, I don't think it would change the Commission's recommendations in any way. We documented in great detail many examples of the failure to share information, and we made that recommendation across the board. And action on those recommendations, we believe, is still necessary. Now, I might point out that you, Mr. Weldon, in your book, wrote, and I quote, "On September 25, 2001, just 2 weeks after 9/11, I met in the White House with Stephen Hadley, the Deputy National Security Advisor to the President. I presented him with a 2x3 chart I had been given in the aftermath of 9/11. The chart was developed in 1999 as part of a Defense Department initiative dubbed Able Danger. It diagrammed the affiliations of al-Qaeda and showed Muhammad Atta and the infamous Brooklyn cell. Hadley's response was, 'I have to show this to the big man,' end of quote. We have not yet seen that chart, and we are open to receiving it."
Recovering my time, the chairman now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to get back to questions on the testimony. First, I'd like to thank you both for being here, obviously, and for all that you do. And I'd like to ask Mr. Crowell a couple of quick questions. First, the Markle Foundation has called electronic directory services a critical step towards better information sharing. And as you've referenced in your comments, it's important both in terms of outlining what we need to collect, but also what we don't need to collect in terms of privacy and civil liberties. What would be your best advice to Mr. Russack about how to establish the electronic directory services? I don't think it exists yet, or unless I'm wrong.
It doesn't exist yet. I believe he issued an RFI, a request for information to industry regarding directory services. What the Markle Foundation postulated was the need for directory services to be the pointers to information wherever it resided for several reasons. One was for policy reasons, in order to preserve the policy about how the information was used with the information when it actually got transferred, so that if there were privacy implications or if there were restrictions on the use, they would be part of the record that gets transferred. The second was for freshness. One of the problems with transferring information among stovepipes in the U.S. federal government in particular is that the information has no, there is no way for the information to get updated. So if information is transferred that is either wrong or that is later changed, those changes don't follow the transfer of the information to other agencies. But by using directory services and pointers to the information, as opposed to actually moving the information wholesale, there's an opportunity to, with technology, solve this problem of keeping the information accurate, fresh, and updated by the people who actually have that responsibility.
And also to make sure only those who need, that people get only what they are permitted to get.
That's exactly right. And also that you control things like, can it be printed, can it be sent further to further distribution lists, and so on, which would go a long way toward increasing the trust that people have in the system that's going to be used to share information.
Do you envision, I just thinking about this, and maybe this is incorrect, that the implementation of such a system might actually solve the need or go a long ways towards solving the need of the government-wide consistent guidelines that you referenced in your testimony?
Well, it certainly would become a facilitator for moving consistent guidelines across organizational borders. It won't remove the need for someone to sit down and decide what some of those guidelines will be.
Let me ask, if I could, just two quick questions on that you mentioned in your testimony. One, the need for a dispute resolution mechanism, as well as the lack of use of the streamlined systems we have for IT acquisition. We're woefully behind in very many parts of the government in our IT area. Do you have advice for this committee and how we might promote changes in those two areas?
Well, on the first one, dispute resolution, the importance of that is, particularly in the beginning of a change in the culture, is to try and move the inevitable disputes that will occur about whether information is too classified to be sent to particular users or whether it can be declassified or sanitized, to move those disputes quickly up to policymakers who in turn then can move the disputed policies back down as new policies and incorporate the disputes into the evolving policies and guidelines that would become important. With regard to IT modernization, the best way I can phrase that is, I won't mention the particular agency, but I know of one agency where the analysts are prohibited from going home and doing any work from home, but they have better tools at home than they do at work. That's a pathetic situation. I mean, at home, I have access to blogs, wikis, to databases, to all kinds of information. Every day I get a terrorism report that is several megabytes in size from a private source that isn't even associated with the government. And I can use that information to review what is happening worldwide on a very, with a little Googling, on a very positive basis. And that kind of technology is not expensive, but it is not being deployed very rapidly, in some cases because of security concerns and security constraints, in other cases just because it opens up the process too much.
Let me follow up with Mr. Hamilton on that point. And it's been a frustration to me. I've been on the Judiciary Committee for 11 years, and we've yet to have an oversight hearing on the FBI. And thinking about just the technology aspect of the FBI and the Trilogy program, which we found out in March of this year, after $158 million basically was scrapped. As far as I know, and Mr. Hamilton, you may know from your service on the 9/11 Commission, we still don't have a comprehensive or working solution for sharing information internally within the FBI. And my question is, how are they going to be partners in information sharing across agencies as well as out into our private sector and local and state government allies if they can't even share information internally? Do you know? Can you give us any information on that? And maybe we should have a hearing on that, since Judiciary apparently doesn't want to exert their jurisdiction. We have concurrent and might be able to move this forward. But Mr. Hamilton, maybe the Commission didn't go too heavily into that, but if you can give us any wisdom, it would be much appreciated.
Congressman Lofgren, I among other things, now serve on an advisory board to the director of the FBI. And they are, I believe, finally seized of this issue. And they recognize the failure of their past efforts, I might say costly failure. But I do believe that they are now trying very hard to improve the information systems within the FBI. Now, I don't think they're there yet by a long shot. They've brought in a lot of highly trained technical people to deal with this problem, and I think there is a very strong emphasis on it now to improve it. So your oversight here is terribly important because of all the changes that are necessary in the FBI, and you appreciate the directors trying to change the whole culture of the institution from law enforcement to
no, and I'm an admirer, actually, of the director, but I have to note that we've had a problem here.
Well, the question is, can he do it? And can he change the culture? And I have no doubt at all about, number one, his ability, nor number two, his intent. He's a top-flight person. But it is a formidable challenge. And I just think you and all of us need to bear down on the FBI, make sure we're fully supportive of what they're trying to do, because that change is critical. If you change the FBI's focus from law enforcement to prevention of terrorism, what that means is that intelligence becomes the area of the FBI's work that drives the entire FBI, because it's intelligence that tells you about possible terrorist activity. So the intelligence effort and the information sharing and the information technology involved in that intelligence effort is just crucial in order for the FBI to carry out its new function well.
Well, I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania with the hope that he can yield me some of his time.
I will, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I just want to respond to some of Mr. Hamilton's comments, just for the record. And again, we're trying to spin instead of getting to the facts. Mr. Hamilton, I've had respect for you. We served together for a number of years. I've never criticized you publicly. But I am absolutely outraged at what's happening here and the lack of aggressiveness in wanting to get to the bottom of this story. You brought up the fact, alluding that somehow Steve Hadley didn't acknowledge. Well, why don't you talk to Chairman Dan Burton, who chaired the Government Operations Oversight Committee, who went with me to that meeting. And why don't you talk to Chris Shays, the chairman of the Government Operations Oversight Committee for National Security, who went with me to that meeting. There were 3 of us in the room with Hadley, not one. You have a problem with what Hadley said. He told me he was misquoted. The fact was, and it's not about a chart. Don't try to spin this about a chart. We have a 23-year Navy veteran who has risked his entire career to tell the truth, that in January of 00, he identified Muhammad Atta and 3 terrorists. He had to seek you out to give you that information in July of 04, and this was the response of the person who debriefed him, who I want to put under oath, Dieter Snell. After he was questioned, he said and this is a direct quote from Commander Scott Philpott. He said, after Scott gave him the information, Dieter Snell said, quote, "What do you want us to do with this information? We go to print in 10 days. Is that the legacy of the 9/11 Commission, that we go to print in 10 days? And therefore we don't even mention Able Danger as a footnote in your book? This was not ordered by some Johnny-come-lately off the street. And you say you interviewed Schumacher, you didn't question him about Able Danger in detail. I talked to them. You didn't question the people that were involved in the operation of Able Danger. Talk to Scott Philpott, as I have 20 times, who's risked his career. You've never talked to him personally. You've never talked to Tony Schaefer personally, who's having his career destroyed right now. You didn't play this kind of role when you were in Congress. You were aggressive at oversight. And I'm not going to sit by while a man's career is destroyed, because we don't want them to be able to tell the truth. And it's going to embarrass this administration, the Bush administration, but I don't care. That was the job of the 9/11 Commission. I voted for it. I support it. I tried to meet with you all. Tom King gave me a 5-minute phone call. I hand-delivered information at the hearing when George Tenet was at the witness stand and the questions were never asked. We gave a packet of follow-up. You never proceed to interview me. And it's not about me. It's about the 3,000 families that had their lives ruined and the 17 sailors on the Cole. We're going to get to the bottom of this, Lee. I'll guarantee you. And there's going to be egg on the faces of people when the truth comes out, because in the end, the truth provides the justice. I yield you the rest of my time.
Gentleman yield.
Mr. Chairman, I think I should have the opportunity to respond to that.
Absolutely.
Mr. Weldon, we want the truth to come out, and I don't want to try to block the truth. And I will stand with you to try to get the truth out. Now, we are not trying to spin the chart.
It's not about a chart.
Where is the chart?
The chart was destroyed, I guess, by Hattie. It's not about a chart.
Well,
it never was about a chart.
Well, it was in your book.
My book mentions it in one sentence.
Would the gentleman
And
allow the witness?
and when those people met with our investigators in Afghanistan, they talked about a chart with Muhammad Atta's name on it.
Come to my office, I'll show you a chart.
With Muhammad Atta's name on it? Well, I'd like to do that. I think, look, that is a very...
Reclaiming my time, the gentleman at the witness table is recognized by the chair.
Well, I'm not sure it benefits us here to go further, but I will say that that chart is an enormously important piece of information. We did not have any information, Mr. Weldon, that prior to 9/11, that the government knew the name of Muhammad Atta. Now, when our investigators talked to your people, well, the people you've identified today, when they talked to those people in Afghanistan, they said there was a chart with the Muhammad Atta's name on it. Now, at that point in the investigation, this was in the year 2003, we certainly knew the name of Muhammad Atta. And anybody in a meeting that heard the name of Muhammad Atta there, that would have been like ringing a fire bell. None of our 3 investigators, the White House lawyer, did not recall a chart, did not recall mention of Muhammad Atta. Now, if the chart exists, let's see it, and we will give it due weight. And let me join you in saying that we don't want to destroy anybody's career. We want to get the information. Just give us the documentary information.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the chairman very much, and I apologize. It was delayed with some other meetings, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Crowell, and would have gotten here sooner if I had known how much excitement you all were having in this hearing. But let me thank you for your service and the previous witness who is now going to be our new manager of intelligence and an important, I think, position in our department. If I might, I will make a statement that will look for solutions, and that is that I do think that we are still making a journey toward securing the homeland. There is much debate as to whether or not we are any more secure today than we were on September the 10th. I think the 9/11 Commission report has been a great roadmap and directive, and we've put in place many very positive aspects, and I think that puts us in the step in the right direction. But I have several points that I'd like to bring up, and I'd engage Mr. Crowell as well on these questions. First of all, with respect to the information sharing manager, do you think that we have an effective position that can generate intelligence down to our federal, state, and local sharing, meaning that we can generate or translate information down into the state and local jurisdictions, and whether they can translate, do we have an appropriate vehicle for that, and they can translate information to us? Use as a backdrop, and I don't want to be coy, but use as a backdrop the recent incident with New York. I have a great respect for Commissioner Kelly. I know him well, but I'm hoping that it was not tainted by politics and local elections. Did we do that right? And is that an example of sharing information in the right way? If you're taking notes, I'd appreciate it, because I'd like to be able to, on the questions, I'd like to be able to finish my questions and then yield to both of you. In particular, Mr. Hamilton, I know your great work, and we worked very closely, so many of us, around the 9/11 report. I was pleased to have been on the Select Committee, the committee before this one on Homeland Security, and sort of worked closely with the work that you all were doing. But maybe we should have hearings. Ms. Loughran has said something very insightful and also indicting, and that is that there have not been oversight hearings over the FBI. I know the chairman of this committee is very astute about these issues. And maybe we should have, moving aside the recent occurrences of politics and in and out indictments and other types of activities, I've always said that the American people need to have the ultimate truth. I think it would be appropriate to hold hearings anew, and they're always said, well, they belong in the Intelligence Committee. I think it's appropriate in the Homeland Security Committee, on the trail of intelligence that led us to the state of war. The reason why I say that is it is more woven around the question of terrorism. And therefore, if it is woven around that question, then that is the jurisdiction of Homeland Security. Let us track the trail, and all the pieces that might not have been addressed by the 9/11 Commission, your task was monumental, and I think the work that you did we'll be forever grateful that we got a roadmap. But we are now seeing the missing links. Should we not convene hearings, oversight hearings, transparent hearings that will engage representatives from the White House, engage the proponents of information to find out how the trail of information either gave us information about those terrorists that might be engaged or did not. And I yield to the gentleman for what was a very lengthy questioning, but I think you can detail them, about three of them. There are about three questions. One happened to be more longer than the other one.
Let me begin to respond, and then Mr. Crowell will pick it up. First of all, with regard to Mr. Russack's job as the program manager, it's been said several times here, it's an enormously important job. He becomes now the key official in implementing information sharing, which is the key aspect of better intelligence with regard to counterterrorism. There's nothing this committee can do that would be more important, I believe, than to stay on top of the progress that he is making and maybe not making, and trying to provide guidance to him. And to the extent that you have hearings to that effect, and I would certainly applaud them, you have to make sure he has the authority that he needs. And if he doesn't have it, you should give it to him. You have to make sure he has the resources and the personnel that he needs. And if he doesn't have it, you should make sure he has it. And you have to keep your focus on this particular office, I believe, to see that it functions. And if this office does not function, then your counterterrorism effort is going to be severely hampered. Now, with regard to the New York situation, I know there's been some controversy about that. The positive side of it is that information was shared from the DHS to the city of New York. And on October the 6th, the New York Police Department reacted to information that came to them from the FBI. And that information suggested that their system, their transportation, was at risk of being attacked in the next few days. The DHS gave a different interpretation to that information than the New York officials did. But keep in mind, they've got very different responsibilities. If you're the mayor of that city and you have this information coming to you, you're going to act in such a way that will protect the city. You also have to keep in mind that the information here keeps developing. You don't get a finished product at 10 o'clock in the morning. What you get is an initial intelligence assessment, which is refined over a period of many hours. But the mayor has to act right away if he's going to protect the system. So you have a very different perspective here. I believe that the New York mayor and the New York Police Department acted responsibly based on the information that was given to them. But it's a dynamic situation. And I can understand why the DHS people had a different interpretation of the information than the mayor did. All of this has to say is that we've got to work harder to get this right.
That's right.
So that there is a consistent message flowing from Washington to the local officials as the situation develops. And we all know it's a crisis situation, and it's very, very hard to do.
Would you just, I know he has to answer, would you also comment on further hearings to sort of determine whether or not we had some faulty intelligence proceeding leading us to where we were in terms of the war, and not so much the war, but interpreting whether there were terrorist threats that would lead us to go to war? Whether further hearings would be appropriate.
That's really outside the mandate of the 9/11 Commission. We did not look at the Iraq War. We acted on the basis of the statutory mandate you gave us. And that told us to do two things: to tell the story of 9/11 as accurately as we could, and number two, to make recommendations to the American people on how to better protect themselves from a terrorist attack. We did not have the statutory authority to look into the questions of the war. That's an altogether different...
If you had it, you obviously would have, if you had it, you would have pursued it. If we have it, you think we should pursue it?
Well, that's the judgment you have to make. And as a person testifying on behalf of the 9/11 Commission, I can't really comment on that.
And I appreciate your consistency with your testimony. Mr. Crowell.
I certainly agree with all of the comments that Congressman Hamilton made with regard to for the information sharing environment. I would add, though, that his job is not really framed around the notion that he will have a responsibility for interpreting or moving information from any of the players, federal, state, local, but rather that he will assist in the development of the policies, the guidelines, the technology, the systems, the training, the environment, if you will, that will allow that to happen within the agencies who have that responsibility today. In that regard, without the necessary resources and without the necessary oversight to see that he is getting the resources and doing the job, I think we run some risk that this very tough job won't get done. So I would applaud any efforts by the committee to continue to review what he is doing and what he has to work with in order to get it done. I know he will put a personal effort into it. Will he get the support that he needs from everyone? With regard to the New York City thing, there's not much that I really can add since I'm not currently involved in any reviews that relate to that, and it's certainly not something that Markle looked at. I just would say that in the case of information sharing, the principal concern is to make sure that the people who have responsibility for taking action, in this case New York City, have all the information. And I have no way of judging whether or not they had all the information or not, but the whole purpose of this effort to develop the information sharing environment is to make sure they know whether or not they got all the information, and that there's an audit, if you will, of the process that gets that information to them. Clearly, your question on the hearings with regard to the trail of information are well outside of my responsibilities in the Markle Foundation or the Markle's current focus, so I won't make any comment on those.
Thank you. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will just self-testify and would think that both Mr. Crowell and Mr. Hamilton, as good Americans, would want us to find out the truth. And so any appropriate hearings that would help us do so in this whole chain of intelligence sharing, as well as the allegations that surround us, might be helpful in this committee. So I hope maybe we'll look into that. And I yield back, and I thank the chairman and the ranking member.
Thank you for your comments on the issue of sharing information. Again, we've had some substantial inquiries into that issue. And I think it's fair to say that sometimes two groups of people can have the same information but draw different conclusions. And in particular, sometimes a trained intelligence analyst will be able to make an assessment based on more information that might place the source of the information in question, whereas a non-trained individual might interpret more information as being a better and better source, if that makes sense. And that's why two groups of people looking at the same information can draw divergent conclusions. And so the information sharing system has to be sufficiently sophisticated that it takes into account the various backgrounds of the people involved. That being said, if our witnesses could bear with us for just a few more minutes, we might do a second round if that's agreeable. I don't know what your time constraints are. Is that agreeable? Thank you very much. Asking my questions, Mr. Hamilton, a few years ago in the 80s, we had a lot of excitement here on Capitol Hill focused around the Boland Amendment and something called Iran-Contra. I happened to be on the Senate side at the time in a staff position. I believe you were actively involved in oversight on the House side. And what we discovered in that situation was that there was a culture of secrecy that even extended from the intelligence community to the oversight agencies of Congress. Fast forward 20 years into the post-9/11 situation, that culture of secrecy has broken down somewhat. Information sharing is a buzzword on everybody's lips, but as you've said, it's still a question of changing the culture. And how optimistic are you that we can actually change this culture? Or do we, in fact, need to add additional sources of information to the equation, namely open sources of intelligence, which are not as highly protected by the secrecy system and the secret bureaucracies, and which lend themselves to sharing?
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you didn't press me on Iran-Contra. That's too far back for me to remember very well.
I won't press you on anything. I just want your opinion.
Well, I think you've
been
got
pressed enough today.
yeah, I think you've got it very well analyzed, and no one can say at this point in time whether you're going to be able to break down that culture. I think the important thing to recognize is that the need-to-know principle, which, as you know from your background, is sacrosanct in the intelligence community, or has been for many years, probably served us very well for many years, and was kind of the abiding principle during the Cold War period. But as you suggest in your question, times have changed an awful lot now, and that principle must not be relinquished, but it has to be balanced against the principle of need to share, so that you have both principles operating. Sometimes need to know is going to prevail, sometimes need to share. I think Mr. Crowell put it very well in his testimony when he identified the risk of failing to share. The concentration has always been on the risk of a leak or the risk of information getting to the wrong person. That's a real risk. You don't want to deny that. But what we found, I think, over and over again was that the risk is greater in terrorism of failing to share information. Look, the government develops, as you well know, millions of bytes of data every minute, all kinds of languages, and we collect mountains of data. 99.999% of it is irrelevant. The task is to pick out those nuggets and to put them together, to analyze them, collect them, and you don't get intelligence information that says we're going to hit the World Trade Towers at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. You get all kinds of hints, and so putting that all together is difficult. Information sharing is critical. I'm reasonably optimistic that if you give us enough time, we can put it together. And your final comment about open sources is critically important. Here again, the intelligence community, as you may know better than the rest of us, has had a kind of disdain for open sources. If you look back on 9/11, and you trace what happened in the World Trade Towers and the embassy bombings and the USS Cole and the fatwas from Osama bin Laden, everything was public, everything. We all knew it. We just didn't get it. And so open sources are just as valuable as the secret sources, I believe, and I like your emphasis on adding information from open sources. I think it's critically important.
Thank you. Mr. Crowell, you work for the National Security Agency, or NSA, which at one point was referred to as NSA, no such agency. 20 years ago, when James Bamford did his book, The Puzzle Palace, Director Lincoln Farr tried to prevent publication because it was the first book ever written on no such agency. So this is an organization with quite a reputation for secrecy. Even the cables dating back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident have only just recently been disclosed. How can no such agency involve itself in information sharing in any useful way?
Well, I'll go back to the earlier comments I made about leadership and its importance in all of this. And I think that if you examine some of the records of the past, you will see that information has willingly been surrendered by agencies like NSA and others as a contribution to history. I cite, for example, the release of the Venona papers in 1995. During my tenure as deputy director, 25 million records were declassified and sent to the archives for use by the American public and by scholars who would study what really happened and return all of that investment to the American people. So it can be done. It is a matter of culture, not just of secrecy, but it's a matter of having a commitment to history and to the importance of information and understanding that history. You know, during the Cold War, the need-to-know principle worked primarily because we had a very focused enemy. And we, in fact, did know who needed to know. I mean, I knew by name the individuals who were responsible for Soviet long-range air and the military officers who were going to respond to any of those threats and attacks. And I talked to them on a regular basis. This is a different world. It's no longer one in which I would be able to personally divine who needs to know about an arrest of Mohammed Atta in a Virginia, on a Virginia roadway. I mean, it's just a different kind of situation. You talked about analysis and how people can come to different conclusions. I used to tell my young analysts that any two pieces of information would not give you any conclusion. As a matter of fact, I could draw an infinite number of circles through 2 points on a board. But with three, I begin now to define something that I can say with certainty, but maybe one of those dots is misplaced, and so the more information I get, the more important it is. I believe that we're missing a point about terrorism as it relates to how we go after these targets. And I'm talking well beyond my Markle experience now. You're drawing upon my other experience. Terrorism has a process. That process includes target selection, planning, recruitment, training, and then execution or command and control. The earlier we can get into that process, the more chance we have of preventing terrorism. And I, for one, do not want to have a system that is just going to forensically document what they did to us. I would prefer to put our efforts into this whole plethora of processes that they are going to be involved in. And that's why members of the Markle Task Force began focusing on information sharing very, very early in our process of deliberation on what needed to be done to make things better. So it's the experience of the people in Markle who have served previous presidents and previous administrations in intelligence positions and law enforcement positions that led us to believe that this new world is not about need to know, it's about sharing information that allow us to know more and come to conclusions earlier in the game. Rather long answer, but important question.
Very discreet. Thank you very much. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this has been a very helpful hearing, and just a couple of further questions for Mr. Crowell. You mentioned in your initial testimony that there was an issue relative to involving law enforcement so long as Mr. Russack reported to the DNI. Do you have a proposed solution to that?
Well, there are two possible paths that you can go down. One is that you accept the fact that he is now in the DNI's office, and the President and those involved in the cabinet in other departments come to some agreement about how they are going to cooperate at a high level with the DNI in meeting the needs across the entire government. The other possibility, of course, is to either reassign him or dual hat him so that he has a reporting chain that gets him closer to these other organizations that must be supported, specifically the Department of Homeland Security and the law enforcement activities of Justice and FBI.
Ms. Lofgren, if I may interject, I think this problem of information sharing with state and local authorities is a formidable problem. I know you've been in touch with your state and local officials, and they really complain a lot.
Yes, they do.
And it's a question of building a relationship and building confidence. And it's a two-way relationship. I mean, the DHS and the DNI and all the rest of them have to pay attention to these local officials and the information they're gathering with regard to terrorism. But they also have to impart the information. These relationships cannot be quickly developed. They have to be developed over time. Confidence is the key, building the confidence in those relationships. And of course, it's a very formidable problem for the federal authorities because they're dealing with so many municipalities and states across the country. So it cannot be expected to be done quickly. But
and the level of expertise varies wildly among the
That's exactly right. There are some municipalities that have expertise that matches the federal government and maybe even exceeds it in areas, and there are others that are very rudimentary.
I wonder, Mr. Crowell, you mentioned, or maybe you didn't, the Markle Foundation, in any case, suggests, I believe, in the letter to the President that Mr. Russack should chair both the Information Sharing Council and the Information Sharing Policy Coordinating Committee. Do you think, is that because there's a lack of coordination between the two bodies? Why is that suggestion being made?
I'm not really an expert on how those two organizations function today, but and they're just standing up. But I think it's because the Policy Coordinating Committee, in fact, is able to set guidelines and policies across the entire federal structure, and it is not a coordinating, just a coordinating body.
I see. A final question for Mr. Hamilton, and I have followed for several years now the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, and it's late. We had a November 2nd deadline for public comment, and I guess the final plan is supposed to be released in February of next year. Have you had an opportunity to review the draft plan, and if so, do you have any thoughts for us on it?
I have not seen the draft plan, but I do have some thoughts.
All right.
Look, it's the question of priorities. You've got thousands and thousands of targets out here, 85% of them in the private sector. What do you decide to protect and what do you decide not to protect? And the Secretary in his confirmation hearing spoke about making hard choices. Well, that's exactly right. And I understand, and you understand, how difficult it is to make these choices, because if you choose to protect this chemical plant and not protect this one over here, and then this one over here is the one that's hit, you look pretty bad. You've made the wrong guess. Therefore, policymakers are very reluctant to make the hard choices on priorities. What I think you have to force the policy people to do is to make those choices as best they can. Otherwise, you're trying to protect everything, and you'll protect nothing very well. So I think the policymaker has an exceedingly tough job here, but it is a job that a policymaker must do. He's got to decide what infrastructure needs protecting. A chemical plant in southern Indiana is not going to cause the kind of damage, if it's attacked, than a chemical plant in the heart of New York City. You've got to make the choice.
If I can, I realize my time is up. I understand what you're saying, and it's hard to disagree with that. I think, though, we're far from even that situation where we're mixing in supermarkets and a miniature golf course, in the case of my district, with infrastructure and telecommunications simply never been included. I mean, never been included.
You have to make these judgments on the basis of the best intelligence you have and on the risks that are involved,
right,
the vulnerabilities that are involved, and the consequences that are involved.
Well, I do want to state for the record, because I did ask, that there is nothing to base the miniature golf course inclusion. People should not be fearful of playing miniature golf in the 16th Congressional District. And with that, I would like to thank both of these witnesses for their excellent testimony. It's really been very helpful.
I thank the ranking member for all of her assistance and participation. We have been joined again by the gentlelady from Texas. Did she have a final comment that she wished to make?
I wanted to pose the question regarding the October 20th report, Mr. Hamilton, from the Public Discourse Project. The project noted various impediments to the operations of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Whenever I think of intelligence, I'm always concerned about, or the gathering of intelligence, privacy and civil liberties. And of course, the board was a creature of the Intelligence Reform Act. I'd like to get your sense of what the ongoing problems with the board that you may be aware of, and what role could the board play with regard to information sharing issues we're examining today. Sharing suggest questions dealing with privacy and civil liberties, and I hope that we could be safe and secure our civil liberties. And what should Congress be doing to address the shortcomings of the 9/11 Public Disclosure Project that has been identified with the board?
I think it's very important to recognize that when you have an elaborate counterterrorism strategy, you are greatly expanding the role of government. You are spending a lot more money, you are hiring a lot more people, and government is becoming much more intrusive. Now, all of those things may be necessary in the current climate, and apparently most people think they are, because we're doing it. But what we said was that if in this environment, and I appreciate very much your question, you have to set up a Privacy and Civil Liberties Board that has power to look into these things across government, not just the FBI, not just the CIA, but all across the government. The Congress obviously agreed with that. You put that into the law that was passed. Now, our concern at this point is that we don't see much urgency here. The President has named the members of the board. The nominees for the chair and the vice chair of the board have not yet been confirmed by the Senate. So far as I know, there's no funding available, no meetings have been held, no staff has been named, no work has been outlined, and no work has begun. No office has been established. This is incidentally 10 months now after the establishment of the board by statute. So I think there's a real urgency here to get a board in place that is a robust board to protect privacy and civil liberties.
Let me thank you very much. That is a very forceful response. And Mr. Crowell, let me acknowledge and thank you for your testimony. Didn't know if you wanted to comment on that. If you desire to do so, I'd be happy to receive your comment.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Markle Foundation has always considered privacy to be a major part of our entire study. We believe very strongly that with the right mechanisms, an oversight board, the right policies, guidelines, and some technology to help audit and enforce those policies, that we do not have to compromise our right to privacy in order to attain a higher degree of security in this fight on terrorism.
Then let me thank both of you for your testimony. Let me thank the chairman and the ranking member, and may I pile onto both your plates possibly an oversight hearing regarding this board, why it hasn't been energized, if you will. We don't have confirmation rights or privileges as the Senate does, but it would be important to ask the administration and others why we have not moved forward and whether or not we can help expedite. When I say we, they can help expedite and encourage the confirmation of their appointees, and as well establishing, as Mr. Hamilton has said, an office, a mission, resources, and staff, I think might be a good parallel to the work we're doing on this committee. And with that, I thank them and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your long and very distinguished careers in service to the United States of America. Thank you for bringing the distilled wisdom of those careers as well as your recent activities to the table to benefit this subcommittee and this Congress. We thank you both very much. The hearing is now adjourned.